This is Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick, back again with part 2 of my conversation with author Russell Hayes talking about his new book, Aston Martin, The Entire Story. Now, in part 1, we covered Aston Martin's history from its founding in 1913 up to the end of the 1950s. So if you haven't heard that episode yet, start there. And this time, we'll pick up on the story from the 1960s until the present day. So without further ado, let's get right to it. Here's part 2 of Aston Martin, The Entire Story with author Russell Hayes. Enjoy. You know, Russell, I have to say that your sense of humor and irony comes through in the book. It's very entertaining.
Thank you. I kind of like to write it as if it's a story.
Well, it is a story, and it's not a dry history. You know, there's a lot of color in there. The personalities come through. It's that kind of thing.
Thank you. I mean, the historian Aston Martin said what he wanted. He was a big supporter, the company historian.
This is Steve Waddingham, right?
Yeah. And he said people would come to him who joined the company and saying, is there a book about Aston Martin I could read to just know what company I'm joining? And he said, this is what I wanted, you know, a car, which I said, right, read that. That's the company you've just joined.
I agree. This is the book for that. By 1959, 1960, David Brown has spent a great deal of money on racing. He's basically feels like they've done what they could, right?
Exactly. He set out to what he achieved, and pretty soon after that win at Le Mans, he disbands the racing department. Although there's a short-lived foray into Formula One, which, because of the emphasis on Le Mans, comes far too late. So they produce this series of front-engined Formula One cars when everybody's going over to mid-engined. So that's a bit of a hopeless effort. Yeah,
and so John Wyer, of course, leaves, goes on to other things. And then in 1963, Aston Martin debuts a new model, the DB5, which of course is the iconic steed of one James Bond.
Of course. But it's funny how things change over time, because at the time, the reception to the DB5 was quite muted because it was seen as the ultimate development of the DB4. And John Wyer called it's just a DB4 with all the faults taken out of it. And the front end had already been seen on the DB4 Vantage. So the look of the front was not especially new. But it was just the ultimate refinement of, and I think the US importer, Charles Cavalli, said to John Wyer, well, this is, how many improvements are there on this car? And John said, well, I saw about 60. And he said, well, look, you should just give it a new name. Call it a DB5. Stop calling it DB4 Mark IV. It's a DB5. So that's how it came about.
The Bond connection cemented this car in history.
Yes, it did. But at first, I think Aston Martin were quite bewildered. It took them by surprise, and they tried to capitalize on the rocketing demand and got themselves in a bit of a pickle with the DB6, because they overproduced a lot of them in the mid-1960s. And then there was a credit crunch, and they ended up with car parks full of DB6s they couldn't sell. So it took them a while to be comfortable with the James Bond association.
Yeah, I think without the film connection, the car would not have the notoriety it does. I mean, I suppose that's self-evident.
Yeah, but it's an interesting point to note that there was a period in the 1970s and the 1980s to some degree where the only association with James Bond was the little corgi toy that kept getting into production, because people didn't have DVDs, they didn't have videos. You know, every now and again on TV at Christmas, you'd get a James Bond film if you were lucky. So the association with Aston Martin did fade, I would say, during the 1970s, because Roger Moore drove anything except an Aston Martin at that time.
Right. Those were the Lotus years.
The Lotus and whoever was paying the most money after that.
Right. Albert Broccoli was no fool.
Oh, no. He knew how to do a deal.
Right. The producer of the films. The DB5, as you say, has more creature comforts and refinement. I mean, air conditioning is an option. A Borg Warner 3-speed automatic is an option.
Electric windows, and it's the largest. It has the 4-litre engine. It's the largest stretch to the Tadek Marek 6-cylinder.
Right. But the model is short-lived, 63 to 65, right?
Yes, but produced in very good numbers. It was a big seller. It was the car to have even before James Bond came along. Most of the Beatles had one.
That's right. Yeah. And then comes the DB6 with a camtail, more room. It is the most produced Aston Martin road car of any model to date, with 1,751 examples.
Yeah. Originally, it wasn't intended to be so long-lived. It went to, I think, 1971 in the end, into a Mark II form. But it helped them out because they were so slow in getting the DBS and the DBS V8 into production. That car really did the business for quite a long time and proved very popular.
Yeah, and it's an evolution in a lot of ways, of course. I mean, the front end is not unlike the DB5, but that camtail, it hit sort of a styling sweet spot of the time.
Yeah, and it was the result of genuine aerodynamic research, which came from the project cars, which latterly had a camtail. So it did provide a degree of stability, which the DB5 and the DB4 had lacked in high speed driving, and a little bit of extra luggage capacity.
I think they also stretched the DB6 a little bit, did they not? They added like 3.5 inches in the rear to give it better, because one of the stumbling blocks for Aston Martin commercially was it's hard to sell a 2-seater car in any number.
Yeah, because it's clientele were getting older, more wealthy, and were having kids. So they wanted something which could, every now and again, you could put the kids in the back, or even two very small adults for a short distance.
And then the next model was delayed, the DBS, but the DBS is a complete break from the past.
Yes, it's the first homegrown styling exercise. It's the first break with the Italian styling. And the designer, William Townes, had come in from the Roots Group, where he'd been working on Hillman's not very happily, and talked himself into this dream job because he was taken on as a seat designer, because I think he'd worked for Rover as well. So Harold Beach took him on as a seat designer, and he said, well, I've also done these sketches for cars. Can I sketch a few cars? And he was there at exactly the right time, and they were open-minded enough to say, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and originally this was intended as a 4-door Lagonda, right?
Yeah, it was a 4-door with the potential to be shortened to be a 2-door.
Right. And William Townes, this was brilliant, I thought. He knew that if the car was wide enough, you could shorten it and it would still look attractive.
Yes. Yeah, he did. Yeah, that was part of it. And also cars American cars certainly were getting wider, and British cars were getting wider at the time. So that 4 quad headlamp look was very popular. And Townes said that he also used the Chevrolet Camaro as his inspiration.
Right. Another car very similar would be the Jensen Interceptor, a wide grand touring car, more luxury appointments, room for 4.
Yeah, it's tapping into the same market as the DBS.
Now, you say that it was an in-house design. It's distinctive because it's got sharp edges. It's got those quad headlamps that were in such fashion in the late 1960s, and the fastback styling. It also has a DDR rear suspension, which is a pretty important upgrade.
Yeah, that was a big investment for Aston Martin, and that DDR suspension would take them right through the 1970s.
Yeah. And as I said, true room for 4. The V8 finally did come on as an option. They finally, got it into production. And they also had an optional Chrysler TorqueFlite automatic transmission, which is bulletproof. The DBS is really kind of a stopgap model, though, isn't it?
It's a stopgap model in as much as the engine it was intended for was not ready. So they have this peculiar situation at the end of the 1960s where they've got two cars with exactly the same engine and more or less the same configuration. The DB6 goes into the Mark II, and the DBS with the same engine carries on, although it's kind of underpowered because it's a larger, heavier car and doesn't suffer well in comparison to the DB6. So that V8 is really the thing that in 1969 gives it a complete new lease of life. And then after that, the six-cylinder DBS doesn't last very much longer.
Hey guys, I want to take a quick break to say if you enjoy Horsepower Heritage, there are a few ways you can support the show. Go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage and become a patron. There's a link in the show notes. You can make a one-time donation or you can support the show monthly. It's easy, and for the price of a latte, you can help me continue to bring you more of the people and stories behind the machines. You can also leave 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify because that helps new listeners discover the show. Thanks for your support, and now back to the show. Then in 1972, they revised the front end styling on the car, and they do away with the quad headlamps, and they kind of soften those sharp edges. And this is a proper British muscle car when the V8 finally comes out.
Yeah. William Towns, before he left, set in plans for a facelift because the quad headlamps weren't terribly popular because a lot of owners reckoned that they didn't give as good illumination from the second pair of lamps. And also it maybe perhaps lacked a bit of character. So the facelift was both for aerodynamic reasons and to bring back the Aston Martin grille shape to be a bit more prominent.
Definitely. Now, they also experimented with Bosch mechanical fuel injection on the V8, but it was problematic, wasn't it?
It was quite high maintenance. It needed a lot of specialist tuning, and at the time it was unusual. So a lot of people didn't really know how to deal with it. And in the end, I think Bosch supplanted it with a different type of injection and weren't keen to supply Aston Martin with a tiny number of systems that they wanted. And also, it was found that they could pass the US emissions test better by just going back to carburetors.
Yeah, that period in the early 70s, everyone was struggling with meeting the U.S. emission standards. And as you say, once again, Aston Martin is ordering in small numbers. It's a problem that plagues them their whole history.
Yeah, they don't have any buying power.
Right. But the Aston Martin V8 enjoys the longest model run yet, from 1969 to 1989.
Yes, that shape has such a long life, right up to the post James Bond period. It wasn't, of course, they might not have intended it to last that long, but needs must. They couldn't afford a totally new model, and they subtly updated over time. It has continual improvements, and I think by the late 1980s, its time has come right back round again, and it looks great. Slightly widened arches, BBS wheels. It becomes a modern classic, and it becomes very desirable right at the end of its production life.
Yes. But now, why isn't it called the DB7? Well, it's because David Brown finally let Aston Martin go in 1972.
Yeah, in the end, the tractor division was making such a loss due to a change in the market that he had to get rid of Aston Martin. I think it was quite a shock. I think it was losing about £1 million a year at that point, and he couldn't indulge it anymore. So he let it go to a group of investment bankers and property people from the Midlands.
Right, and this was a very tenuous period. By 1974, they were bleeding cash. They were turned down for government loans, right?
Yeah. And
once again, the government was like, well, we have more things to worry about, like, for example, British Leyland. Exactly. And there was a lot of talk of just stopping production completely and just having spares and service, because spares and service was the only part of it that actually kept consistently making money. At one point, didn't they, in fact, kind of send all the factory workers home? They did. It officially went into receivership
at the end of 1974, and the production line stopped and the lights went out and they were all sent home. Yeah.
Newport Pagnell must have been a very unhappy town in this period. I mean, so many people depended on Aston Martin.
It was devastating. And a lot of them left and were recruited by Rolls-Royce, who did need specialized body makers.
Right.
And they never came back because they found better jobs somewhere else.
Is Crewe nearby to Newport Pagnell?
No, but they would have relocated.
I see. Okay, good to know. Sort of an infamous character pops up here. I thought this was another interesting bit of trivia. One of the gentlemen who boasts that he will give Aston Martin a loan is Robert Maxwell, later to be a newspaper magnate, but tying it to current events, he is the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, who was Jeffrey Epstein's girlfriend. And this is the one and only time I will ever mention Jeffrey Epstein on this podcast, but I just thought it was an interesting piece of trivia.
He was the prospective MP for Buckinghamshire at the time. There was a general election going when Aston Martin was going down the pan. And he offered to put lots of money in. He actually bought himself an Aston Martin and made sure that he was photographed with it to be back in the company. But, of course, never actually came up with the money and didn't get elected.
However, in 1975, they get these angel investors, a consortium of businessmen, including a gentleman called Peter Sprague, who I think he was the CEO of National Semiconductor. He's an American. And George Minden, who is a Toronto hotelier, right?
Yes. So they didn't know each other at the beginning, but they both come at it from specific angles. Peter Sprague owns an old Aston Martin. He has a DB4 and is alerted to the fact that Aston Martin is in severe trouble by a friend of his who was a distributor for Aston Martin in the States, called Morris Halliwell. And he decides that he can't let this car company die. So he intervenes. And then he realizes he needs another partner. And at the same time, George Minden actually has a franchise for Aston Martin in Toronto, and he has just ordered a load of V8s, which he now can't sell because the company is just about to go bust, and nobody would want to buy them. So I think Minden gave a press conference. Peter Sprague heard of him through the press conference, and the two eventually get together and try to find some other partners to come in as a consortium.
So interesting. Just like 50 years earlier when the Charnwoods bought the company, these guys are enthusiasts. Yeah.
They're young entrepreneurs and they just don't want to see it die.
And Peter Sprague he's very accomplished by this time. He's only 35 years old in 1975, but already he had, even just right after graduating from, I think, Yale University, he was doing business in Iran. He established the largest cold storage facilities in Iran, and then became the chief executive officer of National Semiconductor in the middle 60s, I think. And National Semiconductor will figure into this much more importantly a little bit later in the story. But the next landmark car in Aston Martin history is the Lagonda Wedge, right?
Yes. And that was just madness. It looked like it had dropped from outer space. And that was part of the genius of the management at that time, Sprague and Minden. They were just open to anything. And William Townes had these designs for a wedge-shaped Aston Martin because there had been a dealer who'd been landed with a load of V8s he couldn't sell and had asked Townes to rebody them. That never happened, but Townes produced these designs for these wedgy shapes, which he was very well into and was very fashionable at the time. And Sprague and Minden and Alan Curtis took a look at these designs and said, okay. So that he produced clay models, which could have been both an Aston Martin and a Lagonda, two-door Aston Martin, four-door Lagonda. And they went with reviving the Lagonda badge.
Yeah, it is a wild car. That front end the grill surface area is so compressed and It's got pop-up headlights. And the electronics inside. This is where National Semiconductor comes into play, right? Because the interior design is totally futuristic. There are touch-sensitive controls rather than conventional knobs or switches.
Yeah, it's like nothing has anybody ever seen before. And they had to have at the Earl Scott Motor Show in 1976. They had a separate cockpit where people could just play with the displays to see what they were there because they were so extraordinary.
They built 645 of the wedges from 1976 to 1990. Unbelievable that it lasted that long.
Yeah, it took a long time to get into production. They weren't really delivering cars till 1979. But in retrospect, they did something which became commonplace for much larger manufacturers. They put a concept car out there, saw what the public reaction was, and then built it. But they had no plan for manufacturing it, so it took a lot of trial and error to get it into production.
You tell an interesting story in the book about sort of a marketing scheme with the first car delivered.
Yes, Peter Sprague was very friendly with an English aristocrat, the Marquis of Tavistock, and would stay with them in Bedfordshire when he came over to the UK to take part in Aston Martin meetings and things. And they were great supporters of his because he'd been to university with the Marquis. And they agreed to host the launch of the Lagonda at Woburn Abbey, which still is their stately home. And all the press were there outside, beautiful, beautiful spring day. And the car arrived and then refused to start. All of the electronics gave up, and it had to be pushed into shot by anybody who could help, just to see it would roll down. It would just roll down the slope in front of the journalists, and of course they got pictures for that. And the Duchess of Tavistock was meant to be paying for it with her Amex card. So that was a tie-up with the Amex card. And I love the headline on one of the newspapers was, "It's lovely, darling, but it doesn't start."
Yeah, that was a great take, and it's so typical of the British press, right? Just kind of get that jab in there.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, in 1980, another very colorful character comes into the picture, and that's Victor Gauntlet. And he really carries Aston Martin a great distance.
Yeah, he's a great figurehead because he's this very British. He would almost be a Bentley boy, reincarnated, and he has vintage Bentleys. So he's the epitome of a British bulldog kind of character, and always willing to give interviews to the press, and has a lot of money behind him because he made his money in petrol. He comes already owning a petroleum company, and that gives Aston Martin the next cash injection.
Yes, and there's another money man, Peter Livanos, right? And he's from a Greek shipping dynasty.
Yes, and he also brings in a shipping family called the Papanikolaou brothers as well. And he's a young entrepreneur, loves his cars, is persuaded to go from a Ferrari to an Aston Martin in the States, and then decides this is something he wants to buy into. And I think he's only in his 20s at that point. But the Livanos family are another savior for Aston Martin into the 1980s.
Right. Of course, the Aston Martin V8 production continues. But in 1985, there's another collaboration with Zagato. And I think this is a fantastic looking car. And it's so of the era.
Yeah, that was a very canny move by Victor Gauntlet, who kind of established the idea of limited edition cars, which were only produced in very small numbers. And the market in the mid 1980s was feverish for lots of money washing around for anything that was exclusive, anything that was collectible. So the collaboration with Zagato was a real money spinner, and those cars sold out. They were virtually pre-sold before they'd hit the road.
Underneath the skin, of course, it's more or less a standard Aston Martin V8, right? They do some tuning. It's a little bit higher performance.
It's with Aston Martin V8 without the back seats. It's a shortened
Right.
Aston Martin V8, yeah, essentially.
Right. And it's got this distinctive greenhouse, right? It has a pillarless effect because all of the pillars are sort of blacked out. So you've got a body color roof, but it's like it's floating there.
Yeah, it was a new design by a French automotive glass manufacturer to wrap the glass around the door pillars.
Right. And the designer at Zagato is Giuseppe Mattino.
Yes.
The car really does make a splash. I have to say it's the quintessential 80s aesthetic.
Yes, you couldn't say it's not a naturally beautiful car, but it's brutal and it has a lot of presence.
It's a polarizing design, I'm sure. A lot of people probably don't care for it. And probably a lot of Aston Martin traditionalists hated the car.
I think they were willing to give it a try, but they only had one press demonstrator, and they let it out very, very selectively. So they were very good at giving favors to the journalists who would be kind to it.
Well, this brings us to 1987 and the purchase of Aston Martin by Ford Motor Company.
Yeah, that just came out of nowhere. There was no warning of that because Aston Martin wasn't struggling at that point. Oddly enough, it was doing okay.
Yeah, it was kind of on a lark, right? I think Henry Ford II was at some event. He had met Peter Livanos, right?
Yes, at a classic car event.
Yeah, and they just got to talking, and Livanos kind of just put the idea in Henry Ford's head, and he bought it on a lark. And
I think also the guy called Walter Hayes, he had a big part in it because he had the ear of Henry Ford.
But Ford also saw that Aston could be a great development and test bed for Ford's ideas.
Yeah. Use something low volume to test out new technologies where it doesn't particularly matter if a couple of them fail because the owners are quite indulgent and you're not producing it in millions, you're producing it in hundreds. That's an ideal test bed.
Yeah, pretty smart business strategy. And of course, by this time, Ford had already purchased Jaguar.
Yes, they were on a spending spree. They had very deep pockets at the time, and they wanted to buy themselves prestige names.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in the book by this time in the mid-'80s, Ford is posting profits of like $3 billion annually or something like that.
Yeah, they're having a very good time.
There's a new 32-valve V8 engine, and it goes into the newest model called the Virage.
Yes, that's the last Aston Martin developed engine without Ford's help. And it's the last version of the Tadek Marek V8, although by the time it's finished, it's the same capacity, but it's virtually only identical for a couple of parts. But that 32-valve engine was the first Aston Martin engine which was compliant with all emissions in all markets, which was a big breakthrough for them.
Yeah, that was a challenge. Now, Ford is relatively hands-off early on in their stewardship.
Yes, they were quite smart with it. They left it alone. They left the Virage to develop. They didn't interfere too much. Tried to lead the Virage to find its footing, and they put in place a guy from Walter Hayes who had been PR with Ford in America and head of PR at Ford of Britain, and had also seen Ford of Britain's racing efforts through the 1960s. So a very trusted pair of hands, and he was nearing retirement. But they put him in charge of the Newport Pagnell cars to provide that British link because he was very aware of the heritage and he would fight for Newport Pagnell's survival, producing these very, very, very expensive, very low build gentlemen's carriages.
And it was important. The optics of having a Brit kind of leading things was very important. Yeah.
Yeah, that was important. Yeah. And they had people like Jackie Stewart was a celebrity test driver at the time as well. So they had all those associations.
Now, the motoring press has, I would guess, sort of a lukewarm response to the Virage. They're not particularly enthused.
No, they're not. I don't think it's any faster than the model it succeeds. The styling is a bit divisive, and it had a particular problem with its rear suspension, in as much it would just squat under hard acceleration. And I think the tires would actually rub against the wheel arches. So it had a hard start, and also it it arrived just at the time that Britain was tipping into recession. So a lot of people tried to speculate on them, bought them at this vastly inflated price, and then lost a lot of money immediately. So you ended up with a lot of virages which their owners just wanted to get rid of, or they even wanted to buy their way out of the contracts for the cars they'd already ordered. And that caused a lot of difficulty. So it had a bad start.
Yeah, and another factor here is that a lot of Ford off-the-shelf components started making their way into Aston Martins.
Yeah, there was a bit of a game of how many Ford and Jaguar switches can you spot on the dashboard. But that was always the way with any low-volume British car, right the way through back to the 1960s, because people shared parts. It's very expensive to develop your own switchgear. It's quite understandable to buy in somebody's switchgear where they've already done the development. But also under the bonnet was quite important, like Ford engine management systems. That was a big breakthrough, enabling them to be emission compliant and quite efficiently run engines. That was a big deal.
Ford brings back the DB moniker in 1993 with the approval of David Brown.
Yes, and that was, I think, again, Walter Hayes, who approached Sir David Brown, who was very old by then, showed him the car. And I think David Brown himself said, well, you can call it a DB if you like.
Yeah.
So
I think that was
was a great gift. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. There is some platform engineering in this period. The next car, the DB7, is designed by Ian Callum, and it was originally a Jaguar proposal. But I think it's Hayes who goes to Callum and says, this would make a lovely Aston Martin.
Yeah, and both Callum and Hayes can see that Jaguar is kind of losing interest in the project themselves. So it's not really progressing. And Walter Hayes sees an opportunity to scoop up that car and make it into an Aston Martin.
Yeah, because it's a independent project, right? Tom Walkinshaw is involved, Tom Walkinshaw Racing. It's a design proposal, but it's not an in-house thing. So the project goes to Aston. There's some platform engineering here. They have a choice of inline six and later a V12 engine. Again, still some Ford parts bin sharing going on, but the cars are still largely hand-built, which is important.
Yes, yeah. The body panels are pressed elsewhere and brought in. There's quite a lot of sub-assemblies which are brought in. I would say that the V12 engine, it was a significant investment by Ford. When Ford recommitted itself to Aston Martin, it said, all right, we will develop you a V12 engine just for you. And that did such good business and transformed the DB7 into another league.
Right. This is really, as you say in the book, where Aston Martin gets into the big leagues, right? Because the DB7 has the highest model production numbers in the company's history. They built 2,473 six-cylinders and 4,150 V12s. Again, tiny numbers, but relative to Aston's, past production, it's a huge win.
Yes, that's truly moving to a new era.
In 2001, Ian Callum designs the V12 Vanquish. There's a lot of advanced manufacturing techniques going into the cars now, sort of bonded panels and just a lot of advancements.
Yeah, it's been described as a very big Lotus Elise.
Yeah.
And a lot of ex-Lotus engineers worked on the development of the Vanquish structure. But that bonded aluminium structure set the foundations for modern Astons today, a really versatile platform that can be lengthened, shortened, widened, and is still lightweight and doesn't require lots of pressings and could also be glued and bonded together.
It kind of makes me think a little bit of Morgan. Morgan had to modernize, but yet it's still a Morgan, right?
Yes. On the outside, it's still an Aston Martin, but it enables, manufacturing to continue on a sustainable basis.
By the way, why did they skip the DB8?
There was a discussion about whether there should be a DB8, but Jaguar was working on the XK8 at that time. So it was just considered too close, and they were very sensitive about that time, the people making comparisons between Jaguars and Aston Martins. So they decided to skip it.
Right. I think Ulrich Bez, he was chairman by this time.
Yes, I can't remember the exact start date from the early 2000s.
I think Ulrich Bez, the chairman at the time, said, well, let's just skip it. And like, what's the big deal? We'll go to DB9. And that's exactly what they did.
And that showed that this was something truly new as well, skipping a generation.
Right. In 2005, Aston Martin returns to racing, and it's not totally in-house, right? It's a program managed by ProDrive, David Richards.
Yeah, that was a very smart move. David Richards went to Aston Martin and said, I know you want to get back into racing, but you can't afford to do it on your own. And he came to a deal with them, whether he would run the racing team, build the cars, Aston Martin would supply the name, and they would make money from the marketing opportunities. And also ProDrive would build a series of customer races, which it would sell and fund the program and supply the profit. But it didn't endanger the road cars, which was the important thing.
Very smart move. And Aston Martin's done quite well in racing in the last 2 decades.
I thought that chapter was important because it was consistently successful. And it was a constant presence at Le Mans from 2006, I think, and still is with the privateer teams. So again, you're talking about still a very small manufacturer, which sticks with endurance racing and Le Mans, where other manufacturers, much bigger manufacturers, have kind of flip-flopped. They've come in and out, but Aston Martin has always been there and has notched up quite a lot of class wins.
Russell, why did Ford make the decision to sell Aston in 2007?
Well, they were losing money. Simple as that. They had the big parent company was losing money big time, and so the luxury add-ons had to go. So Volvo was sold off, Jaguar was sold off, and then eventually Land Rover was sold off. Aston Martin always had its cards marked.
All of those marks were under the banner of the Ford Premier Automotive Group. Kind of a grand experiment. I remember that time. It seemed very chaotic in the industry when Ford decided to sell all those brands.
Yes, and it all happened within quite a short space of time. So there was it was the time of a lot of bidding war and speculation going on.
If my memory serves, I think also that the Ford CEO at the time was Jack Nasser, and he was pilloried in the press.
Yes, but he was a huge ally of Aston Martin. He fought for Aston Martin to get what it wanted parts wise, and he was a big ally within the larger Ford group to ensure that Aston Martin survived under Ford.
The sale price was £479 million or $923 million. Those are big figures for Aston Martin. I mean, I think the first time Aston was sold in the 20s, it was for £50,000 or something like that.
Yeah, I think in David Brand paid about 20,000 for it.
There you go. I mean, yeah. I mean, even allowing for inflation and all that, it's wildly different figures. But, I was at the launch in 2015 of the DBX, the Aston SUV. And it was very exciting. This happened in Monterey, California. And of course, it was totally blacked out. We had to turn our cell phones in before we went into the auditorium. And then, the car was revealed and they did the presentation. And it was very impressive.
Yeah, and that was a landmark car for Aston Martin. It had to come. And they'd been a pioneer in a way because they'd brought out the Lagonda SUV concept in 2009. That was quite a good-looking car, but it was way ahead of its time, and people didn't accept it. But then the Bentley Bentayga comes out, and the Rolls-Royce Cullinan comes out, and that changes everybody's perception of luxury SUVs, hyper-luxury SUVs. And the time was right for the DBX, and they were quite astute in building their own platform for it. They could have built it on top of the Mercedes G-Class because I have the links with Mercedes then. But they forged ahead and built their own platform, which gave it a unique stance and its unique looks.
Yeah, I love it. Of all of the luxury SUVs, it's still my favorite. And of course, we have to give a little bit of credit to the Porsche Cayenne as well for breaking the seal on the luxury SUV market. In 2016, Andy Palmer has a very exciting idea, which is that, Aston Martin has never really built a mid-engine car.
Yeah, he sees that Aston Martin needs to compete in the mid-engine arena. And it's something that had been resisted before because it had always been thought that Aston Martin meant front-engine rear drive. But he forges ahead and then he established that link with Red Bull, and you end up with the prototype, I think RB1, which becomes the Valkyrie eventually. So yeah, he was quite right to identify that as a market segment.
For people unfamiliar, tell us a little bit about Andy Palmer.
He was chief executive of Nissan, a British guy. I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. Ended up going to Japan and heading up Nissan, and had a huge amount of industrial expertise. So a very astute piece of recruitment. Somebody who had huge credibility within the motor industry, the wider motor industry at the start, and had moved from mass manufacturing to this small industry, but able to have a vision to expand it.
Andy Palmer is an interesting guy because he's an enthusiast, but he also knows how to make money, how to sell cars, how to do model placement in the marketplace.
Yeah, how to end up with a range of models which gives you a spread in different markets. And at that time as well, Aston Martin is well used to building special models, these one-off limited editions of 100 special-bodied cars or 50 special-bodied cars, which really help the profit margins, which prop up the road cars.
And the Valkyrie is really a Formula One car for the road, right? I mean, Adrian Newey, the most successful Formula One designer in history, is involved. Christian Horner is involved. And I think it's fantastic.
Yeah. It took a long time to get going and went through a number of iterations, but it was a complete no compromise start. It was meant to be the flagship of the Aston Martin mid-engine era, and I think it's done that job. It's credibility as a manufacturer who can produce an incredible mid-engine car.
Aston Martin Cosworth collaboration on the V12, and of course it's petrol electric hybrid, so there is an electric motor in there as well. But that kind of brings us to the current day, and Aston Martin's financial troubles remain, right?
Oh, it's constant fodder for the press.
I mean,
like I said, it's their perpetual. It's their way of being.
Yeah,
that's the way of being, and they are small enough to be flexible, to adjust their sites. At one time, they said we'd make 10,000 cars a year, and now it's 5,000.
Yeah,
but it's quite simple. Make fewer cars, but charge more for them, and make them more exclusive. So each car carries much more profit. So you don't need to build so many of them.
Given all of your deep research and knowledge and writing on Aston Martin, do you care to make any predictions about the future?
No, I don't actually. I don't, but that's what the excitement is. But what I will say is that they managed to capitalize on the name very, very well. I mean, Aston Martin is applied to a lot more things than cars. They've had this investment in real estate design for a number of years. They produce these Aston Martin residences in Miami, which have interiors designed by Aston Martin, and they're just about to launch one in Brazil. And they have tie-ups with whiskies and watches, and at one point even prams. So they're used to leveraging the name, and I think they've just licensed the name. They've just sold the name to the Formula One team for quite a lot of money. So they make sure that the Formula One team carries the name, but doesn't, again, affect the fortunes of the road cars.
You're a smart man not to make any predictions.
Well, Aston Martin has seemed to come back from the dead so many times. I hope it always will.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to make a prediction, it would be that they're going to have money troubles. Their production will be small, but there will always be enthusiastic customers.
Yeah, they just have to keep coming up with the right degree of exclusivity, the right models. And eventually they'll go all electric, but they've been able to put that moment off.
Right, as so many have. Listen, Russell, I hope you have enjoyed our conversation because I certainly have. And I learned a great deal. Like I said before, I didn't know a whole lot about Aston Martin, and now I have just a much greater appreciation for the brand.
Good. Thank you. It's a very complicated story.
It is a complicated story. In 2 volumes, the book is called Aston Martin, The Entire Story by Russell Hayes from Evro Publishing in the UK. That's EVRO publishing.com. And it's also distributed in the United States by Quarto. And that website is quartoknows.com. And of course, as always, links in the show notes. If you want to pick up a copy, I highly encourage it. Russell, thank you so much.
And thank you, Maurice, for having me on. It's been great to talk Aston Martin in such depth with you.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. Support the show by becoming a patron. Go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. And for just a few bucks each month, you'll help keep these wheels turning. You can find more great stuff on the YouTube channel and on Instagram, and I would love a follow on both those platforms. And if you enjoy the podcast, leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you're listening, Apple Podcasts or Spotify, whatever. And until next time, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.